Welcome, everybody. We'll begin in just a moment. Good evening and welcome to our event. My name is Colleen Stillhall and I'm the Director of Programs and Events for the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. And I'd like to welcome you to the second in a series of book talks. This week we have Jose Gelabert-Navia. And on August 13th, we have Stephen Brook with his new book. On August 27th, we have Rocco Sio and Joanna Lombard. On August 21st, we will have the fourth in a series of urban redesign programs on mobility. And just a little bit of light housekeeping before we begin. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to submit your questions to everyone at any time via the chat feature on Zoom, and we'll answer them towards the end of the book talk. Please keep yourselves muted and turn off your video because this saves on bandwidth and gives us a smoother presentation. If you forget, I'm going to mute you. This session will be recorded and will be available on Monday, after Monday, on the MCAD website, which is www.miamicad.org. And now I'd like to introduce the Miami Center for Architecture and Design's Executive Vice President, Cheryl Jacobs.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you. I see some old friends there on the list of people. So, hi, Jeff. Good to see you. And others. So welcome to our second book talk this year. We're really excited to bring Jose Gelabert-Navia, whom I've known for many years, and it's great to have him share this gorgeous, gorgeous book with you. I'm going to put a little pitch in. If you haven't bought it, buy it. It is beautiful. And on the invitation, we have the link to buy it on Amazon. And if you do smile.amazon.com, you can get it and donate money to MCAD, or they donate. So anyway, thanks for calling in. Colleen was let you know about the programs that we have coming up. And please also, if you're not already, please follow us on Instagram at Miami_CAD. We have a lot of great programming coming up for the rest of the year, all digital, and we're trying to keep connected as much as we can to everyone. And since we're all in this new Zoom world, we pivoted, and that's what we're doing. So many of you know Jose. He's a professor and former dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. He's a graduate of Cornell, and he's been a part of the faculty since 1981. His primary teaching focus has been in the areas of architectural design and history of colonialism and globalization in architecture. He was the founder of UM's Rome program, and as part of it, he teaches a course in Italian culture every spring, which I did not know. Maybe I'll sit in on that. That sounds really cool, Jose. Jose has been the author of numerous articles, and has also been, he is also a practicing architect at the Miami office of Perkins and Will. He has lectured in Europe and Latin America, and most recently on the Sustainable Hospital in Brasilia and in Santiago, Chile this year. So Jose, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. And then everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of Jose's talk, I will organize that, and we'll answer your questions. So thanks a lot, and here you go, Jose.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, first of all, I very much appreciate the opportunity of literally sitting down with all of you. I guess everyone's sitting down at home, and actually seeing a lot of old friends who are curious enough to take time to listen to the presentation. One of the things that Cheryl asked me is, well, do you want to share the screen so people can see you? And while you're showing the pictures, and I said, no, let them just see the pictures, as the drawings are much better than my face. But I wanted to take you, as Cheryl said, these are some of the illustrations of a book that just came out at the end of last year. And we had an initial presentation in Books and Books back in December. And in spite of COVID, it's gotten quite a nice reception around the world, mostly online, since a lot of the bookshops have been closed. But the book came out of a visit that I made to Cuba in 2016. And I had not been back in Cuba, where I was born, since 1960. In fact, I looked like the picture you see on your screen right now when I left Cuba, which, as I was discussing with Colleen, most of my images were actually impressions, because at 6, most of what you remember is your own house and your own family, and less about the environment. But I had the opportunity to return 56 years afterwards in 2016. And I always looked at it as though I was looking for the lost steps. And actually, I went back to the house where I was born, and my father had done something which a lot of Cuban parents did at that point. They took their children, and on some fresh cement in the carport or in the sidewalk, they would put the feet of their child. So as you can see there, those are my feet in January of 1955, when I was almost a year old. So the whole trip was
Jose,
extraordinarily.
Jose,
Yes?
are you sharing your screen?
Oh, I thought I was. Okay, hold on. Then
I hope you
let me
are.
go back. Let me go back. I apologize. I'll go back.
Because those are wonderful pictures and we don't want to miss those, especially the little footprints.
Okay, let me, can you see the screen now?
Not yet.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, other people can see it? Okay, good. Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay, so if everyone can see, and let me, so anyway, so then, well, you missed me at 6 years old. So that's how I looked at 6. And these were my little footprints, almost a year old in front of the house. But again, it sort of was a beginning of the trip, really finding, like many people who have returned, their lost steps. And actually, about a year ago, I read this extraordinary poem by Nicolás Guillén, one of Cuba's greatest poets. I tried over the last week to try to see whether I could translate it, and it doesn't quite work the same way. But the last 3 lines is really what I wanted to bring up. He wrote, "I feel since I returned like I'm in a movie house watching my life pass by." And that's pretty much how I felt through the whole trip. It was all these images. Again, I had left with impressions, but as Cheryl said, I've been teaching history of architecture for almost 40 years now. So actually a lot of the images that came back were images that I had shown my students, and now I was seeing them live. The original inspiration of the book was another book, actually, to my knowledge, the only other book that had appeared on really only drawings of Havana, which was done by a Belgian artist called Frédéric Miale. And Miale went there at the invitation of the Cuban Lithographic Society in 1815 to basically do a nice picture book. I mean, there were no photographs then, of Cuba. And they took great pride in publishing the book, and the book was a real hit, so much so that Miale did several books after that, and he wound up actually staying 15 years in Cuba before he returned, where he died in France. But my original title for the book was going to be the same, and then the publisher said it's a little too long. But this was the inspiration. So I put together all these drawings of the trip, many of them, almost all of them done after the trip, from sketches and photographs. And I presented them to a wonderful publisher, Oscar Riera Ojeda, to see whether he would be interested in publishing them. And he was. But he said, you know, we have to frame the drawings into some sort of context. So we need words to go with the pictures. So what I did is I asked 3 folks. The first one, Felicia Chateloin, who is a professor at the university in Havana, the School of Architecture, to write a chapter. The second chapter was written by Victor Deupi, one of my colleagues in the University of Miami. And the third was written by a childhood friend who is now a professor at Northeastern University. So Felicia, who still lives in Cuba, wrote the first chapter, which was called The City Created. And Felicia's chapter, and again, usually you buy picture books just to look at the pictures, but if you get the book or see the book, I think the text is actually, all 3 chapters are quite interesting. So I asked her to write basically a history of the city of Havana, starting from the time it became the second capital of Cuba. That was not the original capital of Cuba, but that it owed its existence to the extraordinary protected harbor which is next to it. And also, again, was not only very attractive for ships to come from the rest of the Americas, but it was also very attractive for pirates who didn't want to go through all the trouble of waiting for the gold, and they could just intercept the gold right away. So the city had to protect itself, and some of the memorable buildings that we know, in particular the Castillo del Morro, which you see in here, were built to protect the city. Although frankly in 1762, the British took over the city for a whole year and the castles didn't quite work. The good thing is after the British left, a year later, they left because there was a trade made. The British gave Cuba back to the Spaniards, and the Spaniards gave Florida to the British. So it was not a bad deal. But again, this is not perhaps the most effective fort in the world, but certainly probably the most iconic building in Havana. And if you sit, as I did in the Malecón, you can't help but look across from the channel and look at this wonderful piece of military architecture by the Antonelli brothers. The city, the very origins of the city were still in what you would call the late Baroque style. I say late Baroque because when the Baroque, for example, here in the cathedral in 1746 appeared, the Baroque had long been gone in the centers of Europe, from France and Italy and other parts, Austria, other parts of Europe. And Spain was somewhat behind in terms of its stylistic development. So we have this extraordinary cathedral, which is perhaps 100 years too late for the rest of the world, but still an extraordinary example of Caribbean Baroque. Curiously, this plaza, which is the plaza appropriately called the plaza of the cathedral, is not exactly in the center of town. It's almost a few blocks away from the ocean. And again, it's like everybody seems, when they do a book on Cuba, focuses on the ruins in Cuba, which I certainly did not want to do. But thanks to the extraordinary work of the historian, they call him the historian of the city, he has been able to marshal some of the tourist dollars into the restoration of a number of these buildings and a number of these plazas. Another extraordinary plaza, also from the origins of the old part of Havana, and I'll show you more images of this later on, is the Plaza de San Francisco. I'll show you images of it is one of my favorite churches in Old Havana that sits next to it, and this one is one of the most memorable images for especially the cruise ships that used to come before Trump and before COVID, because this is where you would get off and enter the city from the ocean. In the turn of the 19th century, this little temple was built to commemorate the first mass that was said in Havana. And actually this one was a building of its time. It's a little neoclassical, very, very tiny temple, which has miraculously survived for almost a little more than 200 years. It's called El Templete. Again, it was, and you'll see several buildings by these same architects, which in my estimation were the best architects that Cuba had in the 20th century, Coantes and Calarrocas. They didn't design, obviously, the original building, but they restored it in the 20th century. But like a lot of things that you will see, even though the work in Cuba was not done by, let's say, the most famous and first-line architects in Europe of the time, it was done by people who actually were very much in tune with what was happening. And this is actually a great example of neoclassical architecture. I think this is the only building I'm going to show you, which was unfortunately, like a number of buildings you see, that did captivate me because, again, I didn't want to focus on ruins, but this building, the top floor is missing, even though it's a 3-story building, and the ground floor is actually one of the best restaurants in Havana. It was quite an experience. You go and you enter and you go to a restaurant on the ground floor and you look up the stairs and you can see clear across to the sky. The second chapter of the book, again written by my colleague in the university, Victor Dupuy, I asked him to write about the architecture of the immigrants. One of the things that, again, since my own family, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second, my own family were immigrants to Cuba. The story of Cuba is not only about the Spaniards that originally colonized the island, but also about all the succeeding generations that came and enriched the culture of Havana. And some of the people that came actually followed the Spanish-American War. And I'm sure everyone listening knows the story of how the war pretty much got started when the battleship Maine exploded off in the bay in Havana after the U.S. had sent the ship to protect the U.S. citizens and warn the Spaniards. And no one knows for sure how the ship blew up. Some people, obviously in the U.S. they blame the Spaniards. Some people even think that some of the Cuban revolutionaries might have blown it to provoke the war. But regardless, this was what set and gave the United States the excuse to actually intervene in Cuba. And it was a very, very short-lived war, only lasting a couple of months. But as wars go, it really was an extraordinary event. The United States had sort of had a reverse embargo that had happened. The Spaniards did not let the United States trade with Cuba. And like many of wars, there's politics involved, but there's also the economy. And the U.S. was very eager to open the Cuban market. So as soon as the war was over, the United States began to invest heavily in Cuba. And this extraordinary building that you see in there, which was the original customs house, which is now the terminal where the ships arrive, the cruise ships arrive, was actually done, even though it's a Mediterranean Spanish style, it was actually done by an American engineer, a man by the name of Barclay Parsons. And Parsons' most famous structure is actually the New York subway. So this was a very unusual building for Parsons to do. But the building is an extraordinarily long building. Again, it was the customs house where originally the ships arrived before they entered the city. And the building is characterized by, again, a very long building with these wonderful 3 towers throughout. This is my grandfather, and this is a picture of when he came to Cuba in 1917. And that's actually a postcard he had sent back to his family. And a very interesting fact that I read about is that you would have expected that after Spain lost the war with the United States, the Spaniards then again either would leave, never come back, never think that they would go to a country that they had lost the war to, or they had lost the war in. And quite the reverse happened. And at the turn of the century, the 20th century, almost 780,400 immigrants came to Cuba. 60% of the total number of immigrants that ever came. So after the Spanish-American War, many people, like my grandfather, came to Cuba more than had come before. And this led to a revitalization of the old part of the city that had really been stagnant for a while. A lot of these immigrants, again, which didn't have much money, went to this part of the city and started, small stores which thrived. And again, it not only housed a lot of this immigrant community, but they really propelled the old part of the city to see a new life. All of a sudden, again, a lot of the buildings that we now remember and know of Havana actually came during the 20th century. This is the Pasaje, the Hotel Pasaje in the Paseo del Prado, which again saw its new glory in the 20th century with these, again, Baroque, not Baroque, Beaux-Arts buildings that began to be designed. A lot of this thing was done by architects, architecture without architects. A lot of them were, as you will see, building done by craftsmen who came to Cuba and found open field where they could not only build the buildings, but they could also try their hands at designing. But there was also a new generation of Cuban architects, and this is, I think, what makes it so interesting and so rich. There were the immigrant architects and craftsmen who came, but also a new generation of Cuban-born architects. And this building, which sits right next to the customs house that I showed you, it was the produce exchange. Now it's an office building, but this is again a grand Beaux-Arts building with a marvelous dome, and which has this enclosed courtyard that goes up several stories high. Again, I was just amazed by this, towering building, almost the equivalent of about 7 stories high, that dominates the Plaza of St. Francis. Now, as I was saying, there were also a lot of architecture without architects, mostly by Catalan craftsmen who came. And you might know that, again, even like now, Catalonia was always in a struggle with the central government in Madrid. And for many years, the number of immigrants that came from Catalonia to the colonies was curbed. But obviously, when the United States won the Spanish-American War and the markets opened, there was a flurry of Catalonian immigrants who also came to Cuba. And not only a lot of the designs, but a lot of the detail of the buildings of that time we owe to the craftsmen. So this is a detail of that building I just showed you in Cetro de Oro. And it's again, the designs wouldn't be what they were if when you got close to them, you didn't see the extraordinary work of not only the stone workers, but a lot of the people who did the casts. Most of these buildings were cast concrete. So I was amazed by the buildings and about the details in the buildings. Probably the best of these craftsmen turned architects was a man called Mario Rotiant. And Rotiant was born in Catalonia, spent most of his life in Cuba, and eventually went back to Spain where he died. And this I found, which I thought was quite interesting. This is an advertisement for his company. And he doesn't advertise as an architect. He's advertising that he sells balusters, columns, pediments, and he says that he's a specialist in the modernist style. So people would buy, you didn't have to have the building designed by him. You could buy a balcony or you could buy a baluster, but he managed to do a number of these buildings. The initial ones were really centered on the old part of the city, but eventually as he became more successful, some of the buildings went up also in the outskirts, and he got grander commissions. I think it's important to, well, obviously this is not the original color of the building. That's why my drawings were in sepia and not in color. But these buildings, important to emphasize, were not buildings for wealthy people. They were actually sort of live-work units where the families would live upstairs and they would have to shop downstairs. But again, the immigrants mostly came from that part of Spain. The craftsmen were there, so they basically all helped each other. There was another phenomenon that happened in Cuba, because Cuba then, as it began, as it freed itself from Spain, there was a zeal to integrate itself to the rest of the world. And one of the phenomena that we had started in Germany, but then became very popular in the United States and other parts of the world, was the notion of the beer garden. And not beer garden, again, not binge drinking or anything like that we would have now, but it became a social place where people could go with their entire families on a Saturday or on a Sunday or on a Friday night. And as you can see, there are children there, and people would dance and talk to each other. And in order to create a fair there, the sponsors of this beer garden, which was a very successful beer called La Tropical, did this extraordinary modernist fantasy, which again would belong in somewhere in Barcelona or in Belgium or another of the Art Nouveau capitals of Europe. And they created a fantasy of a forest with all these follies and fake castles and fake towers that, as you can see, integrated themselves with the landscape. So it was these organic buildings that seemingly sprouted from the jungle. So the buildings, as you can see in there, had actual carvings of roots and leaves, which became an extension of the landscape around. And in the 1920s, then the US began to really not only invest in the island, but began to visit. You might remember that in the 1920s, there was something in the United States called prohibition, and Cuba did not have prohibition. So between that and the fact that Pan Am began to fly from Miami to Havana, all of a sudden it became a favorite destination for tourists, and it was like that. Well, you could say it's all the way till today, except the US tourists are not that many anymore. But there was also huge US investments. Cuba for many years was, their fortunes developed around the cultivation of sugar. So the United States, which was buying the sugar from Cuba, decided a number of companies or wealthy individuals like Mr. Hershey of Hershey Chocolate decided, why don't we buy the plantation itself? So in a matter of a few years, the majority, or certainly the largest of the sugar mills in Cuba were part of the United States. And such was the relationship between the United States and Cuba that in the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge, which to my knowledge is the only president that ever visited Cuba, came to visit, and there he is shown next to President Machado. And in the 20s, Cuba then began to look at Paris and look at New York. And these are some marvelous illustrations from a magazine which became very popular called Social, which was Cuba's version of Vanity Fair. Even the style of the drawings and the typography was very much like Vanity Fair. And the content, even though a lot of it was about social parties and things like that, that's where the name comes from, they actually featured architecture and they featured art. So the magazine, which the University of Miami actually has all the issues, it's an extraordinary testament of that period. This is a New Year's party in the Sevilla Biltmore Hotel, which was actually built by American architects Schultz and Weaver, the same folks who did the Biltmore Hotel here in Miami. And such was the desire to transform Havana that in the 1920s, Machado and his Minister of Public Works invited one of the world's most notable urbanists, Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier, to come into Havana to develop a master plan. And, you know, this was actually extraordinary for several reasons. Not only was it an extraordinary plan, but actually Forestier spent basically the last 4 years of his life working on this project along with a group of Cuban architects. And a lot of his work was actually beyond, he pretty much left the old part of the city alone, but worked around the perimeter of the old part of the city, and then extended the city in true French fashion with these grand boulevards and these landscape streets and these grand plazas, which the Spaniards had never really done before. The image on the left is the Avenida de los Presidentes, which was one of Forestier's big ideas that connected the inside of the city to the ocean. And the ocean, even though what we know, all the images we generally see of Havana now focus on the Malecón, and you know, you always feel, well, this must have always been there, but it was not. The Malecón was actually started by the United States in 1901. Leonard Wood, who was the governor of Cuba, the American governor of Cuba, took what was basically the rear of the old part of the city. And for a number of reasons in Havana, mostly because prior to that, as I said at the very beginning, the city was protecting itself from invasions. So the city was really turning into itself rather than turning to the water. So the perimeter of the city was a no man's land. And Wood started to work on the Malecón, and this went on for a number of years, but the person who really began to realize that the city had to turn itself inside out was Forestier. And one of his grand plans was actually to create this incredible boulevard that went and ran the perimeter of the city and basically circled the old part of the city. And Forestier came up with another idea, and this actually is shown in this illustration. This line that you see in here was the amount of fill that actually was added in Forestier's time and afterwards to create that boulevard. So you can see in this picture, where the original fortifications were. We sort of explains why there's all of a sudden this fort in here, which actually is no longer in the water, but basically sits on land. But what Forestier was doing is actually creating these sequence of grand Beaux-Arts plazas that went all around and actually tied the different parts of the city together. This is one of Forestier's images. This is the time when these great urbanists actually planned every single inch of the city. These buildings in here were never done, but this part in here, in which he took what was originally the mayor's house, but then became the presidential palace. This building had been started before Forestier's time, but in Forestier's time, one of the architects that came, a Belgian by the name of Paul Belot, added the last floor of the building. And again, this building, which again captivated me, now used to be the presidential palace. Now it's the Museum of the Revolution. But the building is again this late Beaux-Arts style. Again, this was done in the 1920s. And because a lot of the fortifications had been cleared around this area, and Forestier creating the plaza in front of it is a building that you can see almost 360 degrees. Also during Forestier's time, this grand the Paseo del Prado really flourished, which again opened the inside of the city to the Malecón. And also during this time where the old fortifications which were torn down, and the space between the old part of the city and the new part of the city, there was an opportunity to put buildings at a completely different scale. And in here you see the flourishing again of the successful immigrants that came from Spain. And they began realizing that, you know, they had done well and they wanted to meet and they wanted to show that now they were a force in the city and in this new country that had adopted them. They created these buildings. This, which was known as the Centro Gallego or the Galician Center, became a social club, and it was built around an existing theater. And now it's actually been marvelously integrated, and it's the most beautiful theater in the city. And again, the style of the building is this extraordinary Beaux-Arts, again, maybe a few years past its prime. But Belot was a terrific architect, and in fact, he called his version of the Baroque tropical Baroque. And I mean, it was, again, this could well have been in Paris. And not to be outdone, the folks from the neighboring Spanish province of Asturias also built their own center. Theirs was done actually by a Cuban architect called Manuel del Busto. And this was also a social club for the Asturian immigrants. And it's interesting because they sit practically diagonally across each other, and they talk to each other, but in very, very different ways. One is this exuberant Baroque building, and the other one is this colonial, more Renaissance type of structure. But perhaps the best known and the most extraordinary of all the buildings in terms of the time that it was done was the Capitol building. And all these buildings were done during the presidency of Machado, who was one of those people, had he stayed only one term, he would have been one of the glories of Cuban history. Unfortunately, he stayed too long, and eventually it led to his downfall. But Machado and his Minister of Public Works, this man that you see here, de Céspedes began this extraordinary program of building buildings all over the city, and the most important of all of them was the Capitol building. I don't have to tell you where the model came from. The building is very much inspired by the US Capitol, but not to be outdone, the Cubans made the dome slightly higher than the dome in Washington, D.C. And, you know, at the risk of sounding, you know, Cuban-centric in here, I would dare say that both in the exterior and the interior, the building is superior. I think certainly in the interior that unlike the Capitol in Washington, D.C., this one has an extraordinary flurry of color and richness of materials that seems to be even more at home in ancient Rome than in 20th century Havana. The building itself, the dome, was actually recently restored and brought back to the golden dome of its origins. But again, it's an extraordinary combination of fine architecture, also by Goantes and Cabarrocas and Eugenio Reinieri and others, and the urban planning of Forestier. In 1924, McKim, Mead, and White, or rather the company, because all three of them were dead by then, designed the Hotel Nacional, which had probably the most privileged location in the city. And it's on top of a promontory outside of the old part of the city. And the building has an extraordinary presence. Unfortunately, the interiors, a lot of the original furniture was stripped and gone. But you can still see, especially in the details of the towers, which I thought were fascinating, where that, you know, tradition of American classicism, especially in the hands of firms like McKim, Mead, and White, flourished. I spoke before of Schultz and Weaver, and Schultz and Weaver, the reason they did the Biltmore here in Miami was because they were the official architects of the Biltmore chain. And they did actually 4 buildings in Havana. They did the addition to the Sevilla Biltmore, and they did the casino, which is no longer there. And they did this, which was basically a beach club called La Concha in 1928. And Schultz and Weaver, and especially their designer, a man by the name of Lloyd Morgan, seemingly could do buildings in almost any style. And they adopted for Florida and for Cuba this Spanish Renaissance style, which obviously we've seen examples like this here in Miami. But like in the Biltmore, like in the Breakers, the details are quite extraordinary. And again, it was even amazing that not only the Biltmore chain, but the Cuban developers would have gone to New York and brought in the architects of the plaza to do this building. Again, typical of this generation of immigrants was this man here, Orestes Ferrara, really an extraordinary character. He had actually fought with Garibaldi in the unification of Italy, and he came to Cuba, became a very successful businessman. He was also a writer. He became the Minister of Finance during Machado, and this was his own house, again designed by Goantes and Cabarrocas, which was, Ferrara was Italian, and so he wanted to recall Italy, and what better way to recall Italy than to ask his architects to do their version of the Palazzo Davanzati. I would say, even a better example of the Damanzati Palace. But like I said, Machado stayed on too long, and he was eventually overthrown by this man in here, Fulgencio Batista, who for many years became sort of the shadow president. He was the power behind the throne, and he let people like this man in here, Grau San Martin, become the president. Well, he pulled a lot of the strings behind because he controlled the army. But just when Cuba had seen all these flourishes of classicism and tropical Baroque, in the 30s, maybe again because of the influence of New York, it began to turn towards New York and towards Paris for the new style that was dominating everything, which was Art Deco. So Cuba began, you know, just a couple of years after the buildings I showed you, showing these extraordinary Art Deco buildings. And it also saw the surge of Cuban companies like Bacardi that began to move from Santiago de Cuba into Havana, not their headquarters, but one of their main office buildings. That became one of their most emblematic ones. And they held a competition which was won by a young architect called Esteban Rodriguez Castells in 1930. And when you see the Bacardi building in Havana, and again, just showing you, this is one of the first buildings this man did, and this being 1930, like I said before about that some of the Beaux-Arts buildings would have been at home in Paris, this building was not a late Art Deco building. This was a building entirely of its kind. And not too far from it, another Cuban businessman decided to do what for many years was the tallest building in the Caribbean, which was the Edificio López Serrano. It's a very, very interesting apartment building with a lot of different apartment types, from small apartments on the ground level and the first few floors to bigger and bigger apartments until you get to this tower. You can see the plan in there. And the building really is an amazing example of Art Deco. And even without maintenance, you can see, you know, behind these extraordinary details, and the tower in particular, it's something that, you know, you would associate with New York or even other parts of the world. It's really an amazing structure. Coantes and Cabarrocas, besides being very prolific, they actually did many building types. And this building, which was one of the great hospitals in Cuba, still a good hospital, done in 1937. It was a maternity hospital, which actually I don't want to go into why it's such a great hospital, because it is as well, and certainly forward-looking for its time. But what captivated me of this particular building was actually the figure at the entry, which shows a mother and child, which is really just a wonderful sculpture for any moment in time. The same architects who did the López Serrano building also did this building, which is still there. It was Cuba's most famous bookstore, La Moderna Poesía. And some of you in Miami might remember we had one here as well. Unfortunately, no longer there. And unfortunately, the one in Cuba, the bookstore is still there, but most of the books are missing. There's only a few tourist books available. But again, Miriam Rosich, again, obviously a lot of these are very familiar for us here in Miami because we have our own great collection of Art Deco buildings in Miami Beach. This is a building that was built over almost 30 years. And what is remarkable is that now it looks unified. but it was done by different people. The final flourishes were done by Ramon Bustos, and he finished the tower. It's now the headquarters of the Casa Las Americas, which is a publishing house. And in a way, it's a little late. This is now, would have been late Art Deco, like 47 to 53. And again, even if you look beyond the lack of maintenance, there's this extraordinary verticality. And again, the final flourish that Bustos did when he added the tower in the middle. The last chapter of the book was written by my friend Alan West Duran. And Alan wrote, he titled his chapter, The City Imagined. And it's a little about architecture, but it's mostly about the other arts. And he talked about the poets like Jose Marti, about the great musicians like Benny Moré, the cinema and Rita Montaner, and about the great, not only Cuban writer, but great Cuban intellectual, Jose Lezama Lima, who not only wrote great poetry, but wrote probably one of the great novels of Latin American literature, Paradiso. But in the 40s and 50s, he published this magazine called Orígenes, which actually gave a voice to a number of young writers and also some of the great artists like Wilfredo Lam here on the left. And here's Lezama Lima. He lived in the old part of the city in a house that is a museum, tiny house, and as you can see, full of books. And out of Lezama Lima, in a way, a lot of these other great Cuban writers, some who stayed and some who left, Guillermo Canfreda Infante, who used to come to Miami quite a great deal, Reinaldo Arenas, who also first came to Miami from Cuba until he went to New York and became internationally famous when his book Before Night Falls was turned into a great film. It's a great book and a great film. And then Alan also spoke about, musicians like El Micha, and those of you who know more recent Cuban cinema, people like Alejandro Brujes, who did his vampire movies and zombie movies in present day Havana. So as a coda to the book, it didn't fit into any chapter. I titled this section The City of Faith, and it was about the great churches in Havana. And I mentioned before the Church of St. Francis. The building I showed you before, the customs house is right here. And this photo is taken across from the Merchants Exchange. This is an interesting building that when they built the Avenue of the Port, they actually took the altar out, which used to sit here. And right now there's a great trompeo where the old altar used to be. But this is a very building from the 17th century, and it has this sort of stripped down classicism. Again, it almost looks like a Roman ruin with its vaulted lights. As you can see, that's not my drawing, that's 18th century drawing of it, but I've done numerous drawings of this building because the essence of it is so powerful. And the other church that always fascinated me was this one of San Francisco de Paula, which is a church also off the old part of the city that has sort of miraculously survived. At one point, as they expanded the avenue, they were going to tear it down. Originally, this building was surrounded by other buildings, and you can see it's almost as though they were shaving everything around it. And fortunately, at one point, somebody decided to preserve it. Not completely because part of it had been in ruins. And again, this is sort of part of what fascinated me about the building, that almost as you went around the building, part of the building you could see in its glory, part of the building you could see in its ruins. So it was, again, something that you see all the time in Rome, where you see the ancient and the not so ancient sort of grafted onto each other. And then the Iglesia del Cristo del Buen Viaje, which is in better condition, but still there is something about it, as you know, the building sort of is overgrown with the trees going up into the ivy, going up into the tower. And the last chapter was on the street and the square, and talking about the quality of the city itself. This building is in the Plaza Vieja. The other drawing was also in the Plaza Vieja. This was the end of the Plaza de San Francisco. And this is an engraving of the original, the cathedral square. And these were some of my drawings of the plaza and then of the tower in the cathedral square. And in the last waning years of Batista, he started out what was going to be called the Plaza of the Republic. And actually, one of the architects who came with Forestier, Jean Lavatout, planned this building, which almost everyone in Cuba that I talked about the building, because I said how much I like this building, told me everyone hates it. They call it the ice crater, a lot of other things, but the building's actually quite interesting. The base of the building is done in the shape of the Cuban star, the five-pointed star. But out of that, Lavatout changed the building actually projects into what I believe it's a marvelous tower that in a way, you know, has some Art Deco elements, but then again, it doesn't, and it's almost a one-of-a-kind building that doesn't have any style. But it is the same plaza where the other more recent familiar image of Cuba is. This is the plaza where Fidel Castro used to give his 7 and 8 hour speeches to 1 million people sitting there in the sun. And the plaza actually, without the people, is sort of a desolate place. It was not a great planning example, but it gave Castro his stage. And I sort of ended my book in terms of recording the history around this time, which in a way was around the time that I also left, because in many ways, with very, very few examples, history really almost froze in terms of architecture. Castro was not particularly fond of cities, and even though he lived in Havana, he was more concerned about what was happening in the countryside. So there was no major public works in his time. But I always like to end this because to me, it was also the reason for going back to Cuba, as many people of my generation. You wanted to connect to the city, but you also wanted to connect to the people. And this is a picture of my father. And my father, who was exactly Castro's age, was in Castro's administration for a few years. And he was the minister, or rather the head of urban planning in Havana. And this picture, my father always smiled when he looked at it because these were two of his assistants, which were two people that had come into the countryside following Castro. And they barely could read or write. And then, but they became his left and his right hand in a lot of what was done. And they were active up until 19 60 when they left. One of these days I'm going to do an exhibit of their buildings, but I always was marveled at, just that flourish of combination of architecture with this a revolutionary spirit that believed that the world could really be changed, as most people, when they were their age, believed that indeed it could happen. And I actually visited this building in here, which is the last building they did in Cuba, very much modeled on Nehemiah's Ministry of Education, which was the Ministry of Transports. And this building, I think, has been torn down. I was not able to find it, but it was a little dancing club that my mother designed. And those days, architects did these collages. They cut out images from newspapers and put them as scale figures. And I always looked at that picture and always thought that that was my mother. I don't think it was, but in my mind, it is. And I wanted to end with this image because both my father and my mother were architects. And this is the picture on their graduation day in 1951 from the School of Architecture in the University of Havana, looking down at one of the avenues that Forestier had made. So with that image, and here is the book, which again is available, like Cheryl said, through Amazon. And if you get it through there, it helps the Miami chapter of the AIA MCAD. So, and you can also see it in books and books. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the drawings and listening a little bit about the history of Cuba.
Jose, it was a beautiful presentation, and thank you very, very much. We have a lot of comments from people about how great the program was. We ran over time, but if anybody has a specific question for Jose, you can put it in the chat. We have a couple of minutes that we can do that. But if you, like he said, go to smile.amazon.com. It's the same as the regular Amazon. And you put in that you want their donation, Amazon's donation, to go to the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. If you want to see more of this presentation, it should be on the miamicad.org website by Monday at the latest, maybe tomorrow, but I would, just in case, wait till Monday. And also, a few people are, inspired to go to Cuba. And I wanted to let you all know that we have an MCAD travel program, and we were supposed to go again this year in March, but you know what happened. So we are planning another trip for next year as soon as we're all able to travel and it's safe to do so. So I see somebody asking how we can sign up. If you send me an email, I will put you on the list. It's Cheryl, CHERYL, at miamicad.org. And we partner with the Copper Bridge Foundation on the Art and Architecture tour. And you'll see a lot of the buildings that Jose was talking about. And hopefully Jose will be on the trip with us. And thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you, Jose. Take care of you.
Thank you for asking me, and thank you all for listening. It touches me very much that you would have spent the time.
It was fascinating. Colleen, I see you on. Did you have any closing remarks? You're muted. You're muted.
Just to let everyone know that the recording will be available by Monday on www.miamicad.org.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
and good night. Good night.
Thank you.